On the 13th of March, it was announced that COVID-19 had arrived in the country. The first case was reported, and this meant that drastic measures like closure of borders was going to happen. As the CEO of Kenya Tourism Board, what went through your mind then and when you thought about tourism surviving amid the pandemic?
Okay, first, I think the first reaction was, oh my goodness, travel is about movement, which means if you curtail movement, it means an industry is basically non-existent. So that's the first thing that went through our mind, but it happened to everybody globally. So from the perspective of understanding that this was a necessary thing that had to happen, I think we very quickly overcame that hurdle that said everything is closed, and therefore we moved on to other strategies. And the strategy that we moved on to was a digital-based strategy, which said, if people can't travel, what will they do? And very quickly there was a surgence of people on social media, people on digital, and people looking to technology to be able to connect with what was going on globally. We then latched onto that and began to run campaigns. The initial messaging was around stay home, stay safe.
Yes.
So we ran a campaign that allowed people to understand that you needed to stay home and stay safe so you can travel later. So that was our first campaign. And as the different markets went through the various stages of COVID, we were able then to message about the destination. We immediately ran a virtual safari that allowed people every day to go on safari virtually. And that kept the destination alive. We then, as we moved towards a time when there was an easing of restriction, where people were allowed to possibly get out of their homes for a bit, were then able to tell them the message was around the magic awaits. So all through that period, we just immediately moved on to a phase that allowed people to remember that the destination continued to exist, and just told them and reminded them why they must just look forward to when the travel opens up, because it was affecting everybody globally, and they would then be able to travel to their favorite destination again.
Yeah. What impact did the lockdown and lack of movement, people and goods cause to the tourism sector before we just go to the reopening of the economy?
It was a huge impact. We lost about 80% of revenue from the point that we had started off in 2019. We saw a decline of about 80% in the industry, and this was global, running into billions of shillings in terms of tourism income and revenue. So this was something that was unprecedented. There was nothing anybody could do about it. But the business of tourism is about moving around. So if people can't move around, it means they really cannot consume the product. And that's just the way the pandemic panned out.
Now, come August, the country was reopened for both international and local travel. However, we could not turn a blind eye to the fact that there was second waves and now third waves, and that leaves domestic markets to be the backbone and foundation of thriving of tourism and recovery. Let's talk briefly about that.
So most markets globally have had a second wave and third waves, as you said, but also the guidance and directives around these markets have been restricted travel. And therefore you find that domestic travel becomes the first port of call for most people, because remember, travel has to have a consumer and a supplier. So the consumer is the individuals that have to feel safe enough. So with the Magical Kenya travel protocols that we put in place, it went a long way to make people understand that the destination is safe. But having said that, there's protocols within different countries that restrict travel, things like quarantine when they go back to their destinations. So what you find is people prefer to travel in and around their locality, because then they don't have that challenge around quarantine when they go back. They don't have the challenge now that is coming up about retesting and that sort of thing. So for the foreseeable future, we appreciate that you will probably have domestic as the latent market for most markets, not just in Africa, but also in Europe. And if you see the messaging around how it is that most destinations are advising travelers is avoid non-essential travel. So that in itself is almost a travel restriction that people have to overcome as they get a lot more comfortable recovering with COVID and recovering with the presence of the vaccine.
How has domestic tourism performed in the country since August, and what do we need to do to sort of inject vibrancy back into it in terms of costing, packages, and even selling experiences?
So domestic tourism has actually been the only tourism that we've had, largely the only tourism that has been sort of active in the domestic market. It's seen a slight recovery from the period when we opened up in the 1st of August. It is still almost about 60% down from the year before, but at least it has begun to spur the industry. What's going to happen, I think, in the immediate future is working with our stakeholders and partners, such as airlines and access. These are rails, road. This is what is going to help us to recover. The partners that we have to understand that the market that we have is a domestic market. It's a completely different sort of clientele, and therefore products need to be tailor-made to be suitable to the domestic traveler. And this has to do with flexibility around booking. It has to do with flexibility around lead times for booking, because that's just, people don't necessarily book a month in advance or 2 months in advance. So there's a learning curve for the traveler domestically, but also there's a learning curve for the providers of the service. Yeah.
Finally, as we wind up, what would be your projection for domestic tourism growth in 2021?
It's difficult to say, because of two reasons. The first reason is that we are currently not outside of the pandemic, right? So just yesterday there was announcement that our positivity rate has moved up from 2% to 10%. There's a talk of another wave coming up. So I don't think it is possible to predict what is going to happen, even with domestic, in light of the pandemic. The vaccine will go a long way in terms of creating comfort and confidence amongst people, but until that kicks in and there's enough to go around, it would be foolhardy to say, okay, I think it will grow by 50%, because you don't really know. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.